All right, next we're going to talk about the causes and consequences of obesity. And again, we're thinking on a societal level and an individual level. So, because, you know, obesity is such a stigmatized thing, just being overweight can be so stigmatized. The idea of just eating too much and not moving enough is usually the assumed reason for why people and kids are overweight or obese. And on like the most basic level, that is true. But the etiology, which means the cause, is really complex. So, and it's interesting to look at why certain people in certain environments are more impacted than others. So you can see here, genetics is obviously an important thing. It does not explain our obesity epidemic because obviously our genes and our genetic makeup hasn't changed that much in 40 years. So clearly what's happening is a social and environmental phenomenon. But there are certainly people who are genetically more predisposed to not only put on weight, but also to experience chronic diseases earlier with more weight gain. So there are some people who, even at a quote overweight level, would have more health problems than another person at an obese level. So that's completely genetic. And typically, if we look at families, we see obese obesity kind of within families, and it's a difficult thing to separate nature versus nurture there. Maternal nutrition status. So women that are overweight or obese are more likely to have children who will grow up to be overweight and obese. And there's been some studies controlling even for kids that are like adopted or live with a different family. And so some of that is thought to be maybe hormone related, that babies that are born in environments where obesity exists may actually develop hormones that are encouraging them to grow and eat more. So it changes their appetites as children and then potentially as adults. Then we look at early life factors. We talk about this, I know, in life cycle, and we'll talk about this more later in the semester. Babies that are breastfed longer are slightly, not a lot, slightly less likely to be overweight or obese. Those babies really benefit more from allergies and some other things for breastfeeding. For obesity, it's pretty actually mixed, but it still is a good, obviously, thing to do. Babies that have rapid weight gain early in life are more likely to become and stay overweight or obese as children. So we see this tracking even in those first 1,000 days. Babies that have some of these exposures are more likely by kindergarten and even 7th grade to experience some of these long-term impacts. There is a little bit of interesting evidence about antibiotic exposure, that babies that are exposed to many doses of antibiotics are more likely to be overweight or obese. And the cause of that is kind of difficult. Maybe it has to do with the disruption of the microbiome. Maybe it just has to do with socioeconomic status, that babies who are not breastfed are formula fed, and there might be a lot of other reasons why. And because of those other determinants, that's why they're on antibiotics, which may have nothing to do with obesity, but there is an association. Then we also know that trauma and psychological challenges are associated with overweight and obesity. There are some people who look at overeating as through the addiction lens. So the idea that addiction is a disease with a treatment. So people that have kind of compulsive overeating, so that would fall into like binge eating disorder, that could be a psychological condition. But it's also been shown that people that have just experienced trauma who have been at a normal weight may also become overweight or obese. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Stress increases our appetite. Increased or decreased sleep can change our appetite and our metabolism. So certainly, right now we're in this pandemic. I'm certain people are gaining weight right now. Most people, about a third of people will lose weight or they'll eat less when they're stressed, and then 70% of the population eats more. So when you think about somebody, though, in an acutely traumatic situation, they're also more likely. And we see children with trauma early in their life are more likely to be overweight and obese adults. And that might be due to comfort. That might be due to psychological changes that occur, almost like that trauma is an exposure to your brain. And that might change your long-term makeup and your stress responses. Certainly environment, which we'll talk a lot about, but where you live, what you have access to is going to contribute. If you live in a place where you have children and the only, choices you have for food are fast food, meals, whereas you might go somewhere else and, there's lots of other healthy options, that will change something for those kids. And then lastly, overall lifestyle habits. And this is where we focus a lot in community nutrition, because we can't change some things. If we can't change genetics, hopefully we can, do things to improve nutrition status for women, which we can do, and change early life. And then the psychosocial, that is really difficult. I mean, those are like much larger things at play, and there's a lot of people within health and healthcare that are working on those. But at the individual level, we think a lot about dietary habits and physical activity. And physical activity obviously is really important, because not only does it increase people's metabolism and burn more calories, but it helps them sleep well. And sleep is one of those factors that is absolutely associated with overweight and obesity. And in my work, I've really focused on the pillars of healthy weight for children are diet, physical activity, screen time, so how much time they're watching TV, and sleep. And those are really the four things. And I think we only often focus just on the first two. Okay, so this is just from your textbook, just sort of showing how this sort of another visual way of seeing that this is a complex condition or situation, and there's a lot of things that contribute. It's very rarely just like a lack of willpower, I think, which is sort of what's assumed. Or in children's case, a lack of good parenting skills. We also see that what your peers and your family eats is strongly associated with what your outcomes are going to be. So if you have healthy weight friends, you're actually more likely to also have healthy weight yourself. So you can see here on the slide, there was a study done of a little over 2,000 people in Framingham, Massachusetts. And they were looking at just BMI. So just take BMI as it is. It's imperfect, but it's a measure. And you can see on this is a social cluster chart. The yellow are people that are obese, and the green is people that are non-obese. And you can see the larger the ball means greater obesity. And they actually saw that people who had friends that were overweight or obese were much more impacted than people whose family were. And some of that may be due to like just our habitual environments, right? If you have a friend who only wants to go have brunch and only wants to go get ice cream and only wants to stay in and bake cookies, versus a friend who, is wants to go for a walk and go hiking and, maybe eats less, we're very much triggered to eat based on social cues. So I think this is very interesting. And there's interventions looking at not just in families, but also peer and social groups. How do we improve health outcomes in that way? I think that's why for some of the interventions where weight loss has occurred, it seems to be most successful when there's a social component. I think that's why Weight Watchers has been around for so long, because there's that social piece. And if people make friends and have other people in that like community, then they will feel supported and be able to maintain their weight loss. The word obesogenic means causing of obesity or contributing to obesity. And we live in the United States in one of the most obesogenic countries in the world. And that just means that wherever we go, whatever we do, the healthy choice is typically not always the easiest or the cheapest or the most available choice. So when you think about media, we are exposed to a lot of advertising for food. Kids are exposed to a lot of that, but there are other countries that restrict it, that just say you can't advertise these types of foods at all on television or to certain age groups. We have cues to eat all the time. If you think about, I always like to think about the person, like the receptionist who has a bowl of candy. And if you're in an office, you might walk by that bowl of candy and maybe every once in a while you'll have it or not. And I remember I was at an obesity conference and they were talking about how there's two kinds of people. There's people that will walk by that bowl and maybe they'll take one day and maybe not another. And maybe they're a little stressed and they'll take two, whatever. And then other days they won't need it. There's other people, though, that pass that candy bowl, and every single time they pass it, they have to make a conscious decision to say no. So when there's lots of those types of cues to eat, let's say it's, free donuts in the break room, it's candy out, it's cheap, junk in the vending machines, it's poor options when you're eating out. Just think about that cumulatively and how many no's somebody would have to say. That stops being about like someone's integrity and personal willpower and starts to be about like that is an environment that is really designed to make it harder for people. And I'm not saying that, having a candy bowl out is terrible, but I think for people that struggle, with having balance in what they eat, I think that actually can be pretty challenging for people. So when we do wellness campaigns in workplaces, that is something that we talk about, having how often is, non-nutritive food out to eat. So thinking about snacks and parties in schools, when you have kids that have, a class of 30 kids and they have holidays and then they have every single kid's birthday and then it's 100 days of school day and there's food associated every single time. There have been some interesting studies showing like the additional thousands of calories that kids would get just from the sweets and the celebratory food. And there's nothing wrong with celebrating. But if that food is happening in school and then the kids are going home to environments where there's a lot of other processed high calorie food because it's, cheaper, that really does contribute to the problem. Portion sizes, right? So you can go online and look at the pictures of like, an original bagel was like the size of a small orange. And then they've gotten huge, McDonald's, they're the smallest size cup you can get. I think at McDonald's, I think it's like the kid size, used to be, I think, a medium. So, and back in like the 80s and 90s. So we've definitely seen portion sizes increase. And then what's available. The built environment, when I talk about that has to do with how things are built in a neighborhood, the design that goes into everything from sidewalks on your streets to where grocery stores are located to having healthy spaces outside. And then if you live in a safe community, if you're in a safe community, you can go out and enjoy your community resources. If you're not, you can't. And then poverty is obviously associated with obesity. So you can see here, this is just demonstrating that there are certainly health impacts of obesity, both in adults and in children. I very much respect the health at every size model, and I think it's really a valuable approach in terms of how practitioners can work with the public. But I do take a little pause because it's not fully evidence-based. There's actually a lot of evidence that shows that people that are overweight or obese do have increased risks of certain kinds of cancers, definitely, heart disease, definitely, diabetes, definitely, hypertension, yes, and death. And any of the people that might say, oh no, but when we look long term, the fatter people or the more overweight people, they actually live longer. Those are only in the studies where they're not controlling for smoking. And once you control for smoking status, you see that, it's because they, the people that are more overweight are the people that hadn't already gotten cancer and other things from smoking. So they have to really take all that into account. You can see, though, even in children, there are a lot of impacts. I know that I had a friend that was working in like clinical like trauma, and they said that they would find, children would die in car accidents, and they would find, plaque buildup in arteries of like 3 and 4 year olds. So kids are being impacted by being overweight and obese. It affects their joints. It affects their mental health. It affects how well they move and how much they're going to enjoy activity as they get older. In terms of costs of obesity, you can see here on this chart, there is an associated increased cost for employers and health insurance companies because people that are overweight and obese are more likely to get sick. So just more likely to catch a cold, have a cold longer, because in obesity and overweight can create kind of an inflammatory state in the body. It's not ideal for health. And then, of course, all the chronic diseases. So we do see reduction in sort of work productivity, military readiness. The U.S. has been really involved in trying to promote wellness in like high schools and junior colleges because they want to have enough able-bodied people, because there are fewer people able to enter the military force and public service like police officers and firefighters because they're not at a healthy enough BMI. And regardless of their BMI, they're not able to be physically fit because of their weight status. It's too hard. It's uncomfortable to be that active. We do also see reduced self-esteem. And I think hopefully with more body positive messaging and more inclusive messaging, I think that can be improved. And I definitely think there are improvements that I've seen in like 20 years in that way, but certainly it impacts self-esteem, especially in an age of social media where you have to be visible and everything's visual. And then quality of life, and then lifespan. All right. And then lastly, let's see here. We also see increased discrimination and then increased health expenses, like I've showed you here. I'm going to have you guys watch something that's very valuable that sort of talks about what that discrimination looks like. I know you already had to do some reading on it, but this actually has real health implications in terms of people's access to care and whether or not they're going to seek health care. So I'm going to have you guys move on to this next link, and then I'll see you in another video.